Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. Hello and welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast at Arihanta Institute. I'm your host for the day, Taina Rodriguez-Berardi, and I'm here with our guest, Christopher Jain Miller. Welcome, everyone. This is our first episode of the podcast. So today we're going to introduce you to all of the things that we have to come, as well as give you some background as to where we're coming from and why this podcast is important and why we want you to listen and why we think Engaged Jain Studies is a really important aspect of philosophical, religious, spiritual study. So welcome, everyone, and welcome, Dr. Miller.
Well, thank you, Taina, for having me today.
Thank you. And I really want to get right into it, and maybe you can give us a little bit of background on yourself and just introduce your place in our discussion, in our world, in our area of study, and we can go from there.
Yeah, sure. Just briefly, I'm the Vice President of Academic Affairs at Arihanta Institute, and I'm also Professor of Jain and Yoga Studies. So I both do a lot of the organizational work here at Arihanta Institute in academia, and I also teach quite a bit as well. So I'd be happy to talk about all of those things as we go through here today. And I'm also one of the co-founders of Arihanta Institute. So I'm very excited to share whatever it is you want to know today.
Wonderful. And as many of us at Arihanta Institute find, we're wearing lots of hats. So it sounds like you have a lot on your plate beyond just research and leading classrooms and also the behind the scenes work. We know each other. We go back a few years. I also work at Arihanta Institute currently in the communications and marketing department, but Dr. Miller was one of my professors in my graduate program when I went back to school to study yoga studies. And that is how we encountered each other in the History of Modern Yoga course, which was, I have to say, my favorite course of the program, and inspired a lot of my research and my studies, and inevitably, I guess, ended me up where I am today. So that is some of how the universe conspired to bring us to this moment in the podcast. So exciting. To kick things off, I really wanted to get down to the ideation or the creation of this podcast. Why the Engaged Jain Studies podcast? And most importantly, why now? And I think both of us were thinking about this podcast in separate places across the world. And I know you have been thinking about it for quite some time. And I pinged you one day on WhatsApp and was like, Chris, what about a podcast? And you're like, yes, that's on the laundry list of things that we would like to do at the organization. But what is your why? Why is this important now? And most importantly, what are you thinking about this podcast in terms of who our listeners might be and who you might be talking to in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer to why is because you pinged me about it from across the sea here. We have been thinking about doing a podcast for quite some time, but we needed the motivation to do it because we're doing a lot of things here at Arihanta Institute that we can talk about today. But one of the things that with regard to our mission, which is really to democratize Jain studies and make people more aware of the Jain tradition, its philosophical approach to life, its values, its principles, part of that educational mission, our nonprofit mission, we thought we could really accomplish through a podcast. I've learned so much through listening to podcasts about a number of topics. There's so many wonderful vegan podcasts that I listen to, for example. There's so many wonderful podcasts about anthropology, about all the different things that we all care about. We know we can pull up a podcast on Spotify or some other thing, and we'll be able to listen to something that we're really interested in and we want to learn something more about. There isn't really one out there at the academic and popular level for Jain studies in particular. And in particular, we're really trying to reach an audience with a popular understanding of what the Jain tradition is, but also bring some educational components to this. So we want to bring educators, we want to bring people who can share about the Jain tradition, to the world, but we also want to bring people to speak to our audiences who are interested in things that the Jain tradition would care about. And so, for example, non-violence, non-harming, as many people know, is the highest principle of the Jain tradition. And that applies in all aspects of life. And of course, we can find these kinds of opportunities to reduce our harm in many different ways with regard to the environment, the climate, to animals, to one another, for example. And this is what we mean by engage when we talk about the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. It's that we want to take these principles of nonviolence, of non-harming, of compassion out into the world. And we want to do it in an engaged way with the world and show how there's many opportunities from many different fields of academic inquiry to really be a better person and to understand how we can be better citizens, how we can be better people to one another, and how we can improve the world and make the world a better place, how we can focus on social justice, how we can treat animals better, all of these things. And so the Engaged Jain Studies podcast is really intended, I think, to bring the awareness of how we can be more gentle, compassionate, less harmful, more caring people in this world, but to do it in a real kind of rigorous way and to introduce people once again to the Jain tradition and teach them about the Jain tradition.
I think that's a really awesome summation of the ideas behind this podcast. And it leads me to my next question or conversation starter that many people ask us when looking to the origins, the activities, and the future of Arihanta Institute, which, we'll get into some of that background in a bit. But just at the top of this conversation, you touched on it a bit in terms of the word engaged. Now, in the academic world, the even practitioner side of Jainism or even yoga studies or yoga practitioners, the words like engaged or applied or embodied are all kind of thrown around in the same conversations. I'm wondering, how did you land on engaged for the name of this podcast, for the main ethos of the master's program, for many of the focus of our online courses? What is the difference and why? Why engaged versus applied or embodied?
It's a really good question. I've also struggled with these words and which one should we use. I mean, you can really use any and all of them individually or collectively because I think they all work. My own encounters with engaged Jainism, or what we might call engaged religion, began in graduate school when I started to read about engaged Buddhism, which is an academic field. And what it does is it looks at the way that Buddhists historically have entered into various social justice initiatives, tried to make the world a better place using Buddhist principles and Buddhist practices. And of course, this field has been established since at least probably the 90s. So this has been around for quite some time. It's important because it shows Buddhists how to be better people, how to make the world a better place, and how to be a better human being. And so there was this pre-existing field, and this field was really interesting because the term engaged Buddhism was coined by Thich Nhat Hanh, who we know, Vietnamese monk, who did so much great social justice work around the world, really, and inspired so many people to be better human beings. It was coined within the tradition. Now, within the Jain tradition, there wasn't an engaged Jainism. Nobody was talking about how can Jainism be engaged to make the world a better place. But there are a lot of Jains and a lot of people who study the Jain tradition itself who do say we should apply Jain principles. I heard you say applied, right? So you hear a lot of people say applied Jainism. We can apply Jain principles to the world and make it a better place. There's also this notion that we should embody the practice, especially in the yoga communities that you and I circulate in. And we know, right? There's this notion that yoga is an embodied practice. Of course it is an embodied practice, right? So going through all of this, I really came to engaged both from the wonderful experiences I had studying engaged Buddhism as a graduate student at UC Davis, but then also when we came to create our master's degree program at Claremont School of Theology, we were trying to look for the right word of how do we describe what it is we're doing here? And that is where the word engaged emerged. In our dialogues and our engagement with Claremont School of Theology, we were in the room just like this, thinking through what do we call this thing that we're doing? And I had in my mind engaged Buddhism. They were already doing engaged things at Claremont as well. And so Claremont School of Theology is one of our partners in the master's degree program that we offer. And we landed on engaged. I can say more about what that means and talk more about engagement within the Jain community itself, but that's how we got to Engaged Jain Studies. We're looking at the way that Jains engage the world. We're looking at the way that Jain principles can be engaged with the world to make the world a better place. And there's much more to it than that, but that's really what it is at its foundation, at its core.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And for me, that resonates in that whether it's the master's program or the podcast or any of our courses, these are offerings for Jains and non-Jains alike, academics and people outside of academia, practitioners, people who are interested in the ideas and ideals of compassion and non-harming, non-violence. So this podcast, I think, is almost even a way to tell these stories from individuals you'll all meet on the podcast. Some of our professors who teach our courses, some of our students maybe in the future, and some of the people who are, practitioners or academics. So I think this is really a wonderful way to allow people to understand what not only Arihanta Institute is about, not only what Engaged Jain Studies is about, but how people can encounter each other and meet people where they're at and learn more about how we can make positive change out there in the lived world, right? Each and every one of us. So I'm super excited about it. And you started going into your background. So I'd love to hear more how you arrived in this field of study, in this place in your life and as a practice. So yeah, can you go into a little bit of your background and how you found Jainism, Jain Studies, and also co-founded Arihanta Institute?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you the short version for the podcast here of my autobiography of a yogi, as they say. I didn't know anything about any of these traditions, yoga, studies, Buddhism, Jainism, any of this stuff for a very long time in my life. And it wasn't until I was an undergraduate and I took a course in Indic traditions that I discovered that there are these Indic traditions of Hinduism, we've probably all heard of, for those who are new listeners, Buddhism, which we've probably all heard of. And then there's this other tradition, the yoga tradition. And then there's this other tradition, the Jain tradition. And those traditions I didn't know as much about. Yoga and Jainism, I hadn't really even heard of them much. And that initial course I took really sparked my interest. I went to India and studied Jain philosophy with the Jain community there. And I practiced yoga and I studied yoga philosophy for a long time. This is in my 20s. And during that whole time, I was working in public accounting as a certified public accountant, chartered accountant. And at first it was kind of a hobby. I was enjoying this, but then we go through things, especially in our 20s, in our late 20s, where we start to really ask deep questions about life. Is this all there is to life? Is there more to life than this? And we have deep philosophical questions. And some of us choose to pursue those further. And that's what I did. And I ended up eventually leaving public accounting and going into full-time graduate school to study these traditions, because I felt that these traditions had something to offer, not only to me personally, in my own personal spiritual and psychological wellness and growth, as many people come to these traditions for, but also for the world at large. The ethical principles, as we've been mentioning before, of non-harming, non-violence, compassion, non-possession, non-accumulation. These ethical principles are built into these traditions, and particularly in the Jain and yoga traditions. And I found a lot of promise in this philosophy. And that's when I started studying Sanskrit and really delving into both the lived practice of yoga practitioners and Jains, but also the textual traditions that they are drawing from, these very inspiring philosophical traditions, particularly in Sanskrit and translating and whatnot. And that's really what brought me there. So I ended up leaving public accounting and going full-time in graduate school because I wanted to teach these traditions, just as all of the graduate students do as well in various ways. And so that's really what brought me here and brought me to eventually founding Arihanta Institute.
Thank you for the quick synopsis of your autobiography of a yogi. I think it sounds very familiar in so many ways, especially for us practitioners in the West, if you will, or in modern contemporary timeframes of encountering a practice almost by chance or through others, right? And then recognizing the core tenets, the concepts of compassion, and not just like a word, right? But like a fully embodied, lived expression of that core tenet of non-harming, and how many ways that can be interpreted across life. And that too is really how I ended up here. Very similarly found a physical practice of asana or yoga and a meditation or going to physical asana classes, and quickly realized that there was so much more behind the practice and wanted to learn more of why these changes were arising in myself, in my friends, from these physical practices, knowing that there's a philosophy or many philosophies behind these practices, and then kind of opening up the world of Dharmic studies, learning more about Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, and yoga studies and yoga traditions. So many of our listeners might find themselves in a similar frame of mind, wanting to learn more about the background of why all of these things that we're practicing and changing our lives and even putting our whole value system to the forefront. And I think it's important that we offer this glimpse into where those things might be coming from. And you mentioned the textual traditions, the historical aspects of the practice, but also the contemporary, the modern, the lived experience. And I think offering that spectrum is really important because it's not a relic. There are, people who across the globe, across the world still practice and are practice and moving these traditions forward. So all of that I find extremely interesting, and recognizing that the history as well as what to take place in the future, what will take place in the future is all extremely valid and important. So knowing your background, knowing that you used to be in finance and stare out a window looking at the ocean, and knowing you surf and do yoga. And we met in LA, which is a hotbed for yoga studies and dharmic studies and kirtan and all of these spiritual practices. I'd love for you to touch on, because you recently came out with your 2024 book, your text, and I'd love for you to talk about that, because I think it gives a segue into kind of what we're talking about and how, bridging that ancient to modern. And maybe we can go from there to talk about Arihanta Institute.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I just actually have it sitting here next to me on my desk because I've been teaching it recently in class, embodying transnational yoga, eating, singing, and breathing in transformation. And I published this recently with Routledge. So thanks for giving me a chance to just briefly mention it. But it is a kind of culmination of the last 15 years of my own journey that I just told you. So if you want the full autobiography, you can read this one. But it's an ethnographic study. And so I was trained in graduate school primarily as an ethnographer, someone who studies cultures anthropologically, living cultures, the living community. And this is how I really got so connected with the Jain community itself. And part of what I'm trying to do in this book in a major way is to help us see that yoga is more than just the postures. You just said that you yourself, and I know this is true. You got into yoga because of the postures, and many people do. They come to a postural yoga class. That's what you would expect to do. Maybe some deep breathing, maybe a tiny bit of meditation, but it's generally the postures. And that has received a tremendous amount of focus in yoga studies. And what I'm trying to do in this book is bring our attention onto different practices within yoga that are equally, if not more important than the postures themselves. Because once you do that, you really start to pay attention to the ethical principles. How do we eat? What do we eat? Who are we eating or not eating, right? Do we eat animals or not? These are questions that the yoga and Jain traditions have been asking for a very long time. And so the first chapter of this book looks at the way that yogis eat in a particular community that I was trained in Los Angeles, but that had come from a female guru in Long Island, New York. And it looks at her transformative system of diet, of yogic diet. The second chapter then takes us to Hawaii. And it was there that I learned to practice, as you said, kirtan, the sacred chanting of a lot of things, Sanskrit and different languages, and also even in English, of singing devotional music to the divine and then meditating and having some kind of profound experience as a result of that practice. And then the third chapter takes us to India and studies pranayama. So we look at what it means to practice pranayama in pollution, because we were being told in India that when we practice pranayama, it cleans out our lungs and our subtle channels and toxins out of our body. But if you're doing that in polluted air, what does that mean? Does that really happen? And so this book really kind of probes these three different categories of practice: eating, singing, and breathing in yoga, and brings a critical lens to them. And at the same time, explores these Sanskrit texts and what they say about these practices. So what I'm really doing here, and this kind of inspired the engaged approach, is I'm engaging yoga practice in these living traditions with critical scholarship from food studies, ethnomusicology, and pollution studies, which are things that yoga practitioners usually don't even think about. But what I show in this book is that you can engage these two different worlds of academic and practical inquiry, and you can find out new things about your yoga practice that are, I think, critically important to understand.
Thank you. I really appreciate your expression of scholar practitioner. Many of us who are interested in the Dharmic studies and traditions beyond just the drop in class or the ceremonial or, the lived experience, but want to know kind of how these worlds collide, if you will. I really appreciated your book and the accompanying course that you facilitated because it really brings to heart, and not to overuse the embodied or engaged or implied language, but it really takes all of these aspects of tradition and practice and brings them together from a really unique lens, looking at these unique communities and how they express their traditions. So your text is available now, right, in digital and print versions, and you can find it on our website and all the places on Routledge and whatnot, right?
Yeah, it's available. If you just Google embodying transnational yoga, you'll find it will come up from Routledge. They did a good job on their SEO.
Nice. Well, wonderful. I think, like Dr. Miller said, if you want to get to know him a little bit better, the text goes much deeper into his origin story, and also is a cool way to just follow along the adventures of being a yoga practitioner, a yoga scholar, a researcher, right? Many of our students are really interested in the full spectrum of what that embodies or what that looks like. A big part of your story is really at the forefront of what you do today as the VP of Academic Affairs at Arihanta Institute, and also professor of both our self-paced online courses and also the master's program in Engaged Studies. And I'd love if you could go into the founding of Arihanta Institute and why that even, how did that even happen, right? How do you start an institution of learning and higher education? And what's the vision behind that? Can you give us a little bit on those topics?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, we all shifted online. And I remember you were in my online course during the pandemic. And we started to realize the power of online education. And we really saw this happening. This is when I was working at the university before this, but we really saw that this is a powerful modality. Yes, it's not in person. It doesn't have that element to it, but we saw all of the other benefits to online education and saw that there was a pool of very devoted students who actually really saw this modality as better for them because they didn't have to move. They didn't have to leave their jobs. They didn't have to pick up with their families and go somewhere, leave their friends, to go study with professors who they wanted to study with, whose values they resonated with, which is usually why people go to graduate school. And, it was powerful during that time. And during the pandemic, I had various conversations with Parveen Jain, our CEO, talking about online education and Jain education in particular. And we started to think that, now is the time to create an online institution of higher learning in Jain studies and to eventually pursue accreditation, to be able to offer graduate courses, to be able to offer self-study courses, to be able to offer a podcast like we're doing right now, to create as many online educational opportunities for people to study with the Jain scholars, the yoga scholars, as you say, these other experts from other allied fields of inquiry, without having to pick up and move their whole life, and to do it in a way that's extremely easy and convenient. And so the Jain scholars, there's not a ton of them, but there's more and more of them every day. And the yoga studies scholars, again, it's a growing field. They're all over the place. And so what we've tried to do here is create an online space where people can come and meet them regularly, study with them regularly, and have access to their expertise, have access to their reading lists. I mean, the things that these scholars have are not in the reach usually of the public because they're so buried in manuscript collections or in libraries. And so what we try to do is create this online meeting space where Jain studies is democratized, yoga studies is democratized, these other allied fields of inquiry. We'll see scholars coming from various worlds in vegan studies and climate studies and social justice. You will be able to study with these experts here in one place. And so Arihanta Institute was really intended to do that. And the engaged approach, we kind of spread across the whole platform, which means that we don't just teach Jain philosophy. We are a Jain founded institution, but we also teach topics, as people will see in our learning areas, that resonate with Jain values. So if you care about animals, if you care about the environment, if you care about one another, there will be courses about those things that may have nothing specifically to do with the Jain tradition itself, and there will be the Jain philosophy courses as well. We're kind of a Jain school, if you will. You can think there are a lot of Christian institutions, our partner, Claremont School of Theology, for example, who have programs where there are people of faith, people who come because they have faith or they have spirituality and they want to know more and they want to study it at the highest level. There's nothing like that for the Jain tradition. There are a lot of great Christian theological schools, for example, but there's nothing like that for the Jain tradition. So we're really creating that where people can come study the tradition critically, but also respectfully and constructively as scholar practitioners, as practitioners who want to have a better spiritual life. And so we've created an academic space that doesn't exist anywhere else. And that was really the vision behind that, and to do it online so that it would be accessible to anyone, anytime, all over the world.
The idea of accessibility really piqued my interest when initially I learned of what you were doing with our CEO and founder, Parveen Jain, and teaching the principles globally to many different levels of interest, I think is really an interesting, and I think it's an inspiring angle to think about education at the highest levels. Because when you think about universities and what it takes to kind of, you even mentioned like for graduate program having to move and upend your life. And, when all you want to do is just learn more and gain wisdom, right? So we have two other full-time professors at Arihanta Institute that are going to be introduced in the podcast in coming episodes. But can you just talk a little bit about how even the differences in terms of your research and your approaches with Dr. Kojan Bohanec and Dr. Jonathan Dickstein and yourself as the core faculty of Arihanta Institute?
Absolutely. So right now we have 3 full-time faculty and many visiting faculty. And I can say a little bit about the research and approaches of the 3 core faculty, myself, Jonathan Dickstein, and Kojan Bohanec. So Kojan has been with us almost since the start. Dr. Bohanec has really helped us out a lot. His key area of focus, or his 2 key areas, I might say, are really languages. He's really, really good with teaching languages. So he teaches Sanskrit, is going to be offering Gujarati, and eventually down the line in the future, other languages such as Prakrit and Hindi, hopefully. He's training in those now to be able to offer those. But he already teaches Sanskrit, and he's a wonderful philosopher. He has such a philosophical mind and philosophical approach. And he's also been involved and published in the area of animal advocacy. He and his wife as well, Hope Bohanec, whose book is actually behind me here, that we both have chapters in. He's been across the spectrum in terms of languages, philosophy, animal advocacy, and these worlds of veganism. And then Jonathan as well. And I don't think it's by chance that he was attracted to our institution as well, Professor Dickstein. He also has been focused very much in the world of South Asian religions, now Jain studies, Sanskrit, studying Sanskrit as well, vegan studies, critical animal studies, all of these worlds that are very much overlapping with Dr. Bohanec. And then my own world as well. So I started out in yoga studies, went into Jain studies shortly thereafter, studied Sanskrit like they did, studied a bit of animal studies, became vegan because of all of these studies. And so we really overlap with a very firm commitment, I would say, to these disciplinary approaches to the study of the Jain tradition. And I'm also an ethnographer. So I bring the kind of cultural study of the living traditions in a way that I was trained in graduate school. So we combine these different approaches. Jonathan does a little bit more historical, philosophical, Kojan's philosophical, linguistic, and I'm more the ethnographic kind of how does this all being lived in the world today. So all those combined together overlap quite a bit, but also give us a kind of unique, rounded approach, interdisciplinary approach to the study of the Jain tradition, yoga traditions. And it reflects in our teaching and in our research, I would say, very much.
It does. I think the 3 of you are a very unique and powerful mix of approach to both academic and lived study of these traditions. And I think as the editor of the Arihanta Institute blog, I see it very specifically in how your writing styles vary and how you approach each of your topics. And this is kind of a plug for our Defining Jainism series, if you will, on our Arihanta Institute blog, where our professors take on different questions that we see from our students in the field, even on social media, people wanting to know, what and how certain aspects of the tradition are practiced or where they can be found in textual sources. So I think it's really unique how you each approach the subject, make it palatable for a wide audience, and even answering some topics as like, what does Jai Jinendra mean? Or what is the deal with the Jain tradition and root vegetables? Or, what about fasting? So there's all these aspects that I'm really appreciative that you all answer in a very well-rounded way. And again, you can find all of those articles on the Arihanta Institute blog under Defining Jainism and get to know our professors and their style a little bit more as you begin to dive into maybe what could be their courses or even the master's program. And then speaking of our courses, we have so many topics and professors. And as the VP of Academic Affairs, all of this kind of arrangement and management and selection falls in your lap. And I'm curious how and what you look for when you are coming up with courses and who you look for in terms of professors, and even explaining a little bit. We do have professors that are from the academic world and then others from the Jain community centers. So can you give us a little bit on our courses and your thoughts behind how you manage that?
So there's kind of basically two levels of courses that you can take with us, either certificate level or graduate level accredited courses at Arihanta Institute. I'll say first a little bit about the certificate level courses, because these are courses people can enroll in whenever they want that are on our webpage. And I think we have 40 plus now courses that we put up, and there are a lot more coming. So keep an eye out for these. Some of them are taught by myself, Professor Dickstein, Professor Bohanec, but then we also invite a lot of visiting professors, people who are key, as you say, scholars in the field of Jain studies and yoga studies in these areas, but also from the community, as you said. And the way that we select them is that we really look for the top scholars that are out there working on topics that we know are relevant and that our students will find relevant. So, for example, we had Ellen Goff from Emory University, who is the kind of expert, the guru of Jain mantra, and just wrote a book about Jain mantra called Making a Mantra. We invited her to teach a course that became very popular on the platform as a visiting professor. We invited Professor Jeffrey Long, who taught a course on Srimad Rajchandra and Gandhi, Gandhi's Jain influences. We all know who Gandhi is, but do we know that Gandhi was extremely, just like Martin Luther King and others, very impressed by the Jain tradition and Jain principles? So we have courses like this taught by university level professors who are very well known in the field, allied fields of inquiry. We also, though, go beyond, as I said before, Jain philosophy and Jain approaches to philosophy and these types of things. And we also invite people who are aligned with our values, right? And so that may be other scholars who are teaching things about the environment, about animals, about social justice, about professional ethics, who may or may not have any knowledge whatsoever of the Jain tradition, but its values are so aligned that we would invite people to teach these courses. So we very selectively try to find the best of the best to bring those. And of course, we have a lot of exciting things coming up in that regard. And then we also go into the community, the Jain community. There's a lot of wonderful members of the Jain community who inspire me so much, who are working on various issues, all the things I've talked about with regard to our different learning areas of the climate, environment, social justice, vegan studies, and these kinds of things. And so people can take courses pretty much any time. Sometimes they can take them live. Sometimes they can take them as self-study courses or some hybrid version. We have a whole variation of offerings. And if they subscribe to the newsletter, they would know that those things are coming up. And then we have our graduate level studies. And our graduate level studies, people can come get an accredited graduate degree from a school in California, Claremont School of Theology, who's our partner in creating the master's degree in Engaged Jain Studies. And there they can take courses not only with Arihanta Institute professors, but also with wonderful, wonderful, brilliant scholars at Claremont School of Theology. They'll get exposed to Jain philosophy. They will get exposed to vegan studies. We now have a concentration in veganism, animals, and ecology. They can take a concentration in yoga studies. There's a whole lot of things, interfaith, interreligious dialogue, a number of wonderful topics taught by the consortium that we brought together between these two institutions. And the idea is always that, you're learning some Jain philosophy, but you're also engaging it with these other ideas that exist about how to be a better person, how to be a more spiritual and well-rounded, compassionate human being to each other and to all forms of life.
Thank you for explaining that, because the reason I bring up our courses and the professors behind them that are putting together, all of this educational offering is these are many of the upcoming guests that we will be featuring on the podcast as a way to give our listeners and our students an opportunity to learn more about our courses, our professors, the topics within Jainism, and also beyond, like you said, that have similar values and expressions. And I think the podcast is a great vehicle. You can be jogging, you can be washing dishes and be learning at the same time, right? As a preview to our courses, some of our future courses, but also we'll even go back into the catalog and talk to several of our professors who have taught courses for us and may also have some things working in the future. And I think it's a good way to preview and learn more about the academic side of Jain studies and also the community side too, right? The engaged lived experience. So speaking of future episodes and guests, you and Professor Dickstein will be doing a co-led course, which will be previewed in an upcoming episode of the podcast. And this is under our upcoming Vegan Studies Initiative. Can you talk a little bit about the initiative on the larger kind of umbrella scale, but then also the course that you're working on with Dr. Dickstein?
Absolutely. So the Vegan Studies Initiative is kind of a dream come true for me personally, and I know institutionally for Arihanta Institute. And I say that because for personal reasons, I became vegan after being vegetarian for a very long time, after studying Jain philosophy. And after working with Jains who are vegan and who are encouraging others to be vegan for all the reasons that vegans know. And I just fell in love not only with the Jain tradition, but with the vegan world through this encounter, through this engagement, you could say. And that experience really sat with me and transformed me personally, spiritually, and all of these things. And that was almost 5 years ago when that happened. Now, sitting here today and having created this institution of creating spaces where we can study things that are aligned with Jain values of non-harming, compassion, and whatnot, we now have this Vegan Studies Initiative where the courses, largely speaking, most of them are really taught by experts in the field of what we're calling vegan studies, which could be from critical animal studies, environmental studies. It could be doctors, medical doctors. Some of them could be Jains. Many of them are not Jain. But the focus is really on compassion, non-harming, and how to just be a better person. And so this is a really inspiring thing for me because it really aligns with Jain principles so well. The vegan world aligns with Jain principles so well. And what we're doing is we're bringing it into engagement with these Jain principles in various ways. Now, the first course will focus most on the Jain tradition and veganism to introduce people to what the Jain tradition is, what its principles are. Many vegans know what ahimsa is. They've heard of this, but they don't understand that it has this deep, long history that was brought forth through the Jain tradition itself. And no other tradition, I think, practices it at the level that the Jain tradition does, both today and historically. And so this is a really exciting opportunity for us in this first class. We'll introduce people without getting too much into it about what the Jain tradition is so they can understand it, where these principles come from. And then we'll get into why Jains are finding opportunities in veganism to practice non-harming in a better way, to practice compassion in a better way, to be more Jain, as many of them have expressed, right? So what that really boils down to is the question of dairy. Jains have been basically lacto-vegetarian for thousands of years, but because of the industrial dairy system that is so devastating today, many are transitioning to giving up that dairy, right? So it's becoming a quote-unquote Jain veganism. And so the title of the course is Jainism, Veganism, and Engaged Religion. And so again, this is bringing that engaged approach into the course itself. And Jonathan, Professor Dickstein, and I are going to show what happens when you take a Jain tradition with this long history of nonviolence, and then you put in front of it the opportunity of veganism. When you engage those two things together, something new happens, and it's already happening. And so we're going to share that with both our Jain and non-Jain audiences in this course and answer any questions they have. And really, it's the kickoff to a much longer series of courses taught by experts could be in Jain studies, but most of them are coming again from like critical animal studies, environmental studies, vegan studies, and they're really focused on particular aspects of veganism. And we're talking about some really big names. We're really excited about these scholars who are excited to work with us on this program. We're really creating the first kind of global hub for vegan studies. And there's no better place to do that than in a Jain institution, which has been so committed to non-harming for thousands of years.
Very exciting. You even worked behind the scenes to create these concentrations within the MA program that include both, yoga studies, but also veganism, animals, and ecology, which I think is really speaking to many of the folks who come to the MA program and their interests in the vegan studies or the animal advocacy aspects of it. And then really looking forward to all of the amazing courses that we'll be offering under this initiative, as well as some of the online conferences, speaker series, events that we have planned. So lots to come in that regard. And you'll hear more along these topics, including veganism and speciesism, plant-based food systems, greenwashing, the misinformation about animal agriculture, sustainability. So lots of different topics that we'll be covering in this series of conversations, but also courses and events and conferences and so many areas where academics from all over the globe are going to be converging. So lots of opportunity for those who are interested, and we'll be sure to keep you posted on the podcast and beyond. You can always sign up for our newsletter on arihantainstitute.org to keep in the loop. So as we begin to close out this first episode and conversation, I just wanted to bring up an opportunity to convey what this podcast will look like now and into the future, but also beyond that. I know you're working on an edited volume. We have, like we said, this larger initiative. What else is going on in the background of all of these new and exciting activities?
Well, I hope the podcast will be a nice touch point for people to stay in tune and in touch with what's happening on a regular basis here at Arihant Institute. Not only will they learn new things from scholars and practitioners from all over the world, but they'll also have an opportunity to check in with what's happening, what's going on at Arihant Institute. So we'll try to make it very timely and engage the ideas with what's going on in the real world. We are doing a lot of research. I mean, we do a lot of things here. We work hard. The professors, I know you work just as hard as everyone else, right? We're all putting in a lot. We're a nonprofit institution, but we're driven by the mission. And the mission is, fundamentally to democratize Jain studies and also to really advance Jain studies as a field and research. And so we're really committed to creating this subdiscipline in the field of Jain studies called Engaged Jain Studies. We'll be making a presentation about that in our Dialogues in European Jain Studies soon, an event soon on that. And what this really entails and where it comes from is a book that I'm currently co-editing with Dr. Bohanec here at Arihant Institute called Engaged Jainism. And this book is a new and innovative approach to how do we do research in the field of Jain studies. I'll just briefly explain what it does, but I think it's going to be a really important contribution because there is an existing field, as I mentioned before, of engaged Buddhism, how Buddhists make the world a better place, how they draw from their traditions. But this field has a long history that we've learned from. It's also made some mistakes that scholars have admitted it has made. And so we're actually trying to pick up where engaged Buddhism has left off and join into these conversations by trying to make engaged Jainism as methodologically sophisticated approach to Jain studies as possible. And that really entails doing hard research, critical research, not being afraid to call things out that may be out of alignment with Jain principles, practice both within and outside the Jain community, but also to celebrate those aspects of the Jain tradition that we talk about all the time, non-harming, compassion, and how we can do it in a better way. And so we've gathered together a number of scholars from various disciplinary approaches to Jain studies, and we've asked them to write about engaged Jain studies from their particular disciplinary approach. And there are many facets to how they're doing this. Some might be, again, celebrating the history, the philosophy of the tradition itself. Others may be helping answer questions in the fields of philosophy that Western scholars haven't been able to quite answer adequately yet, or could use a little help with by bringing the Jain perspective in. So we have a chapter on business ethics, for example, that's showing how the Jain tradition can really enhance professional ethics. We also have anthropological approaches in this book, and we're really going to focus on the way that Jains interact with scholars and the way that scholars interact with Jains, and what are the sort of unwritten social contracts between scholars and Jains who are funding the careers of many scholars. Is there a kind of research contract that has to be signed there to make sure that the research is objective as possible, and the problems that come up in the research process when those boundaries get crossed? So this book is really multifaceted, very methodologically sophisticated, as I mentioned before, and I think it'll make hopefully a big hit in the field of Jain studies and really launch the work in the field of research that we are now plugging ourselves into. So there's a lot of other things happening. We'll have a lot of self-study courses coming out for people. We have ongoing conferences coming up on topics related to everything that we've talked about, where we gather scholars and experts from all over the world and community members as well to really try to drive this educational mission that we have here to really share the Jain tradition, these allied fields of inquiry. And really, I mean, we all have a place in our heart. I know you do too, Taina, to make the world a better place. And that's usually why people go into education, not only for their own self-knowledge, which is fine if they do, but a lot of people want to bring that knowledge out into the world, especially in the world that is just having so many issues right now, so many challenges. What can the Jain perspective bring to this? And what can it bring to this with regard to its conversations with philosophy, with science, climate science, critical animal studies? That's really what we're trying to do here at Arihanta Institute.
Thank you for that summary. I think you really hit on all of the ideas behind why we do what we do here at Arihanta Institute. It's really interesting to hear your take on this kind of idea. And I know you touch on it in your Embodied Transnational Yoga book, but like this idea of critical and sympathetic awareness study, and as a scholar, bringing those aspects into your research or encountering those aspects in your research or in the communities that you're embedded within, right? And I think it's important to convey that, because a lot of the people that come to our courses that want to apply to our master's program, many of them are really thinking about how not only to look at these topics as outsiders, as, interested, like looking at specimens, but really wanting to see themselves within the practice, within the scholarship, and recognize what they can do to not only transform their own lives as practitioners, but how do they create this sense of application and engagement in the outside lived experience. So to me, that's a lot of what I see people coming and wanting to learn more about the master's program is what is that mix, right, of just straight, third person scholarship versus involvement within the tradition and or the topic.
Yeah, one point that I'm glad you brought up there is that in defining what engaged Jain studies means, one of the terms that we borrow from a food studies scholar, Garrett Broad, is this notion that we are engaged scholars. So we didn't make that term up, but there's the engaged right there. We are fully embedded. We came to this because we care. We didn't come to this, as you say, from a kind of colonial outsider perspective to kind of objectify the Jain tradition and objectify the world. We're here at fully embedded practitioners in various ways, just like you are. And I know that's why you do these studies as well, right? We are embodied. We are in it. We recognize our history. We recognize the history that brought us into the study and the research itself. It's not just a matter of curiosity. It's a matter of passion in life, really. And so thank you for reminding me of that. I mean, sometimes it doesn't come across enough, but you're absolutely right that we are fully embedded in this process. And our students are as well. We don't just study these things as a curiosity. We truly, deeply care. And that's why we're here. That's why I left public accounting. That's why all of our scholars didn't go into another career where they could have made a ton of money. We are here as academics. We've devoted our entire career here to be engaged scholars and to make our students engaged as well. They already are.
Exactly. Well, that's all my questions for today. And wow, how the time flies. So I'm looking forward to all of the conversations that will happen on this podcast in the future with our guest today, Dr. Christopher Jane Miller, but also our other hosts and guests throughout the upcoming episodes. So yeah, is there anything you want to end out with or leave us with before we close?
I just want to thank you, Taina, because if it weren't for you and you saying, let's do a podcast, we would not be here doing this podcast. So thank you. I appreciate you. And you did a wonderful job hosting our first episode.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you too. And I'm looking forward to this both creative and academic endeavor. So thank you all for listening to the first episode. And we'll be sure to bring you lots of content and interviews in the future. Take care, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.